Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Hope the Corona break is finding you healthy and safe. Please stay that way. I, miss you guys. So we're going to wrap up talking about imperialism today with our third imperialism video. Now, I'm giving China its very own video, and the reason is this, is that a huge motivator behind most of what we were doing was the idea that we would get access to the Chinese market. It was one of the two huge markets that imperialists were trying to exploit. The other one, of course, being India. Keep in mind, India is completely under direct British control by the turn of the century. There is no chance we're going to trade there, other than a limited trade in drugs that U.S. captains were engaging in. So what we had to focus on was the market we could get into that wasn't completely controlled, and that was China. Then, as now, the largest population on Earth, massive number of people, and generally people who did not have access to industrially made goods. China had lagged technologically in the last century or two, and that had put them behind the eight ball. Had China, industrialized, they would have been the ones producing these goods most efficiently, and everybody else would have been buying from them. But because they had lagged, that didn't happen. Okay. So why did we want to get to China? So one, as I mentioned, it is a market to sell goods. The U.S. makes stuff. We can only sell so much to our own people. We need to sell somewhere else. We've been hitting on this point for a while, ever since we talked about the Transcontinental Railroad. That market is there. It's also a source of cheap luxury goods. Things like China plates. We just call, fancy plates China. It's because that's where they came from at the time. The Chinese produced massive quantities of this stuff, and we could get it very, very cheap in trade for industrialized goods, and it became a common cheap luxury item. Tea became commonly sold at very low prices because of this as well. Silk, not quite so cheap, but same idea. You're getting the idea. These were all goods that people wanted. Captains going over selling industrial goods could sell those, fill up their ships with this other stuff, and still come back with money to spare. It was a pretty good deal. Finally, it was a source of hard currency. By hard currency, I mean precious metals currency. Remember this argument we've been having over, gold standard and all that for a while? It's still going on, and this influx of hard currency, the Chinese used a silver currency, and that was a benefit to the United States, because anything you bought there meant that silver transferred from China to the U.S. That was of material benefit. The British, by the way, have something called the pound sterling. Part of the reason they've been able to keep up the partial backing of the pound sterling with silver is that they took so much out of China, much like we did. And then finally, it's a target of, or not finally, next one is it's a target of missionaries. Remember, Christianity was in a high point in the United States and Europe. There was a big movement to go out and convert others. They thought that they were saving them. And so China was a popular destination for missionaries to go to. And governments protected them because this was popular work back home. And finally, China is politically weak. They have a weak empress, a weak emperor, and they are not in a position to resist. They also have a weak military. Most of their military is still using guns and that sort of thing. Still using swords and that sort of stuff. The guns they use are old and not terribly useful. So they had a very difficult time resisting when they came to blows with the European power using modern bolt action or break action rifles compared to their old muskets and swords. So it was not a close, there was a lot of problems there for the Chinese. All right. So keep in mind what we do to gain access to this. We build the Panama Canal. That is not cheap or easy. And that was primarily designed to get our goods to China cheaper. We've already built the Transcontinental Railroad. Same purpose. Connect factories to San Francisco so goods can be shipped out the West Coast easier. That's what it was primarily for. It also helped settle the West, but its primary purpose was getting goods to China. We'd set up factories producing stuff that we were not going to use in the United States with the idea of the export market. Export the goods, bring back luxuries, but also bring back solid currency. That's the situation you want to be in as an imperial power. All right. What did all this lead to? All of this led to something called Sorry, I didn't have enough board space. Called the Boxer Rebellion. U.S. troops had already knocked out the Spanish colonies and occupied the Philippines, so we had a nice, decent-sized military sitting there. What happens in China is that foreigners had been taking such advantage of that weak Chinese government I was talking about. Missionaries were becoming more and more resented. And what was going on was that there was a revolt that popped up, not against the government, but against the foreigners. And these were called the Boxers. They were called the Boxers because they tended to practice some martial arts skills, and they believed, or at least they said they believed, that if they did these properly, they were bulletproof. Turns out they were not bulletproof, because martial arts doesn't make you bulletproof. But that was their belief. And early on, this was a serious problem for Christian missionaries who were walking around undefended, or for small groups of foreign soldiers who were just massively outnumbered. Even Chinese peasants with farming equipment as their weapons are a serious threat. And over time, some of them start to pick up guns and gain access to that kind of thing. What this leads to is the United States, Britain, Japan, Germany, Portugal, Italy, and a few others getting together to gang up on China and lay a pretty serious beat down. The government of China never really backs it or doesn't back it, so it's kind of in an odd position. But what ends up happening is these European, American, and Japanese troops march into China, annihilate the Boxers in battle, knock off the parts of the Chinese army that have chosen to back the Boxers, and take over the capital in a very short order. This was a big loser for China. This meant that Europeans were going to have even more access, and the Chinese would have even less control than before. What does this ultimately lead to? This ultimately leads to, first, a nationalist government in place, and then finally the communist government of today. And it leads to the Chinese having a pretty strong suspicion of outsiders. One understands it. The current communist government has no interest in allowing outsiders onto their territory, no interest in getting involved in other countries' affairs, in the same way that we have, largely as a result of this situation. It has left an indelible mark on China, and it is always kind of sitting there when the U.S. has to relate to China. So that's a long-term effect. Eventually, of course, as you know, China would become strong again. They would get themselves together. By the 1980s, they would have a solid military. By the early 2000s, they would be one of the preeminent industrial powers in the world. But it took a long time to recover. That's 80 years. That's basically a full lifetime to recover from what had happened at the turn of the century. All right, so that's our last piece of video on this particular unit. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.